welcome to this event on shared e-scooters. I'm Director of Strategic Projects at a think tank for London called Centre for London. One of my big areas of interest in the last year has been micromobility and e-scooters. This event's being organised by Zag, who have become the kind of go-to source really for news about e-scooters. And when I ask e-scooter companies what's going on in the UK market, they just say, go to Zag, it's all there. So very grateful for Zag for inviting me and the rest of us to this event. And the aim really is to be able to sort of expose, reveal good practice, both internationally and emergent across the UK, and really to help us shape programs for shared e-scooters across the UK's towns and cities, including perhaps eventually, even in London. I need to say thank you to our sponsors. We have Zag's Trends section partner Dot and our event sponsors Bird and Link. As I said, we're going to be focusing tonight on shared e-scooters, so those which are provided by rental companies. This is the thing which has been legalised in the UK recently, rather than going into the sort of wider topic of privately owned vehicles and the like. So that's our focus tonight. I'm going to start, though, just setting the scene in the UK before I introduce our illustrious panel, so that we're kind of grounded in a sort of shared truth, if you like, about what's going on. We hope to have a panelist from DfT who may be able to sort of improve and shape our knowledge of the legal situation. But basically, until July, e-scooters were illegal on roads and pavements in the UK. This law was changed, accelerated somewhat, it's fair to say, by COVID, by the government, who wanted to bring in trials of shared e-scooter schemes. Amazingly, Middlesbrough were first to get one up and running and operational within almost a week of the law changing. So schemes have been running through the UK since about that time. We now have about 22, I think, deployments in the UK. Again, go to Zag, you'll find out the latest. Some of the kind of shape of what we're allowed to do here. Well, we're not allowed to ride on pavements, that makes sense. Operators have to provide insurance overall for the scheme. Riders need to have provisional driving licenses. That was a bit controversial in the spec. Helmets, perhaps controversially too, were recommended, but aren't mandatory. Speed limits are capped to 15.5 miles an hour. And as I've sort of grudgingly mentioned earlier, us in London, we don't have anything yet, not even a tender for a potential scheme, although we know lots are working behind the scenes to try and make this still happen. We're joined tonight by an illustrious panel, a mix of experts from the UK and the US. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to be joined by Gia Biaggi from Chicago and David Belliard from Paris. Events have got the better of them, I'm afraid, but we do have with us Mike Waters, who is Director of Policy, Strategy and Innovation at Transport for West Midlands. Mike's a veteran of 20 years transport planning and policy. He's also embedded in Coventry University's Centre for Mobility and Transport as a researcher on connected and autonomous vehicles, which occasionally get called cabs, slightly to my irritation. We may hear more of that later. We're also joined by Brian Matthews, who's Head of Transport Innovation in Milton Keynes. Brian bests Mike on this and has 30 years of local transport experience. He's worked on issues like road safety, parking, electric buses, driverless cars, and citywide electric vehicle charging infrastructure. We also have Sam Simmons from Northamptonshire County Council. Welcome, Sam. Sam's a public health professional and has worked in local government and higher education with a particular focus on health improvement and promotion. And finally, last but definitely not least, we have David Zipper, who's a bit of a veteran of events I've chaired on this topic over this side of the pond. David is a visiting fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School, and he's worked in local government in New York City and Washington, DC, where he guided response to the emergence of ride-hailing services. He's also a venture partner, a startup advisor, and a journalist. You may have seen him write about urban innovation, very good articles in The Atlantic, Wired, Slate, and Car and Driver. So I'm going to start by asking just those of you that have a sort of UK area representing, to just tell us a bit about what's going on in your space, as it were. Maybe Sam, we could start with you. Tell us what's happening in Northamptonshire on e-scooters at the moment.
Okay. Hi everyone. So in Northamptonshire, we are currently operating Voi, our operator, and we're running e-scooters at the moment in Northampton. We launched in Northampton on the 3rd of September, and we're also going to be launching in Kettering slightly later in the year. At the moment, we've probably had around roughly 80,000 rides during that time, so just over 8 weeks. We've got about 10,000 users, and about 70% of those are kind of returns. So I think we've had quite good uptake in that sense. The average journey is probably about 15 minutes as well. So I think, yeah, it's been well used.
Great. Let's hear next from Mike. What's going on in your patch?
Just unmute there. So our patch is the West Midlands conurbation. That's about 3 million people spanning sort of Birmingham, Wolverhampton, Coventry. We've started quite small. We started similar time to Northampton. I think probably fairly similar experience in terms of numbers of return users and uptake. Yeah, it's been a very strong positive response. We're focused on Birmingham. We're taking a slightly different approach, I suppose, in some respects, of really focusing on optimizing the technical performance and operational aspects before we then intend to scale up to, for example, in Birmingham, we anticipate about 2,000 scooters in the fleet ultimately.
Is that within the trial, Mike?
Within the trial, yeah, so quite large. Again, we're single operator, same as Northampton. We've got Voi on board, and that's a single operator across the whole of the conurbation, with about 5 proposed trial zones. We're just live in Birmingham at the moment. And we've kind of really been narrowing down on how to optimize the way the kind of ambassadorial team is working on the ground. Been working with the police, and they've been tackling some of the wider issues with the illegal private e-scooter use, which is naturally conflated with the legal shared rental scheme use. So that's something we focused quite hard on. We've been focusing on things like the number plate deployment, although they're not technically a legal number plate, but an identification plate. And we've got quite a strong research program. So we've been working with Voi and with some of the partially sighted and mobility impaired communities. Voi's been leading that program. So, and then we'll rapidly expand up.
Thanks, Mike. Excellent. Brian, what's going on in Milton Keynes?
Hi, yeah, Milton Keynes. We launched quite early in the piece, so around late August, and I think we're the only UK location at the moment where we've got multiple operators. So we went with Lime, Spin, and Ginger, and the reason behind that was really to give our residents a choice and try to understand how slightly different operating models would work within the city. The launch covered the whole urban area, around 200,000 people, and each of the operators were allocated 300 scooters each to deploy. And again, Lime deployed all 300 and from day one. Spin took a more measured approach of slowly ramping up the numbers, and Ginger was somewhere in between. So we got a good mix of how the deployments were working. We chose to go for a free flow dockless solution, really to match the geography of our city, which is a polycentric city, anywhere to anywhere, lots of journey demand. And we wanted to try to learn about journey patterns before we tried to fix anything through docking or solutions around that. So we designed a scheme that was working with the operators to be very responsive to issues as they arose and correct them very rapidly, and that's proven to be the case so far. And metrics-wise, yes, we're getting around 100,000 rides now. Typical journey is 12 to 13 minutes. Usage per scooter is 3 to 4 times per day.
Great. And how does it feel as a user? You've got 3 operators would I find 3 scooters from 3 different operators in the same spot?
Generally, yes, you do have that, and you get the co-location. Certainly, in popular locations like the railway station or the shopping centre, they do tend to congregate, and users start using them. It was quite pleasing to see users on a Redway, our network, on different scooters, happily chatting to each other, smiling away. And obviously, they both chose to use a different scooter for different reasons, but we'll work in harmony. It just has been a bit of a challenge for us to work with the operators, because we know they're commercial beasts and they want to deploy. So as a sponsoring authority, we've got to manage that relationship, which has not been tricky, but you just do have to be a little bit careful to how you work with each operator.
A quick fire question to each of you before we go to David to hear about the US scene. But on a kind of scale of 1 to 5, what's been the level of political controversy about these schemes? Sam?
I suppose it depends what you define political controversy as. I think Northamptonshire is interesting that obviously we're a county council, and then you've got borough and district councils as well. So maybe a little bit different to some of the areas where it's just kind of a city county council or city council. I mean, I think we've had some councillors that are really, really on board and really enthusiastic about it. I think others have had more concerns. I suppose from my point of view, sometimes it's hard to tell if they're concerns because it's their own sort of personal concern, or whether it's come from some residents that have expressed concern to their kind of local councillor and things. So I think giving a number is political. I'm in the middle.
So some political resistance, but no major media like negative stories.
Again, I think some of the local media maybe hasn't been as positive as I would like. I think it's that separation between what's actually being written and kind of the way that people are talking about it, and I think when it launched, there was kind of a misunderstanding. Well, should they be on pavement? Should they not be on pavement? You get 1 or 2 children using them through their, say, taking their parents' IDs and using them that way, and then you get kind of a comment of, well, I didn't think they were for children. So I wouldn't say all of the media has been massively positive, but I do also think some of that's just kind of misunderstanding the scheme. And again, private e-scooters sometimes get wrapped up in the conversation about the trial e-scooters.
Yeah, fair enough. So Mike and Brian, just a quick kind of 1 to 5. What's the political controversy level in your space at the moment? We won't hold you to it.
I mean, I won't put a number on it for the West Midlands. I think it's fair to say all of the political leadership has been very supportive of us doing the trials from the get-go and throughout. Clearly, there was some negative coverage on Coventry, where there was a mutual decision between ourselves, Voi, the operator, and the city to just temporarily suspend the city centre trial while we focused on the design, and that was a safety-led decision that was mutual. I think that got a little bit probably overinflated because it happened. We made a very quick decision early on in order to regroup. Elsewhere, it's been very positive, and there's still a very positive dialogue between Voi and Coventry and ourselves, looking at how we can get a slightly different approach in Coventry, which we're still working on, and that's very positive. So yeah.
I'd forgotten Coventry was in your patch. My mistake. This was not meant as a trap for you. Don't worry. Brian, in Milton Keynes, controversial or not?
No, I think similar to Northamptonshire, the widespread political support. The only political controversy we had was Boris turning up to have a ride on a scooter when we run by an authority of a different flavour. Let's put it that way. So we had that nice controversy, but yeah, widespread support. Some negativity from the press, but again, I think that's a little bit between misunderstanding and speaking on behalf of people that they perhaps hadn't talked to get the real message from those people. So, but yeah, generally very, very, very supportive.
We found it took a couple of weeks of get to positive people's stories where the scooters were helping lives of real people. Much easier in the first few weeks to pick on examples of irresponsible behaviour, which is always going to occur no matter what the mode of transport. It just takes a little while to get to the positive side of the picture.
Yeah, and I'd support that. That's exactly the same that happened in Milton Keynes.
David, so over to you. If you can, a kind of thumbnail of where things are at with shared e-scooters in the US. You've probably been through, certainly more than us in terms of experience.
Sure, and thanks for having me. It's great to hear America described as being progressive, especially today of all days. So let's hope even more so tomorrow. But putting that to the side for the moment, it's been quite a journey with e-scooters in the United States over the last several years. I guess it was now, about 3 years ago, they first appeared in Santa Monica. And frankly, listening to you all describe what's happening in Northampton or Milton Keynes or in Coventry, it sounds a lot smoother than it was in the US when scooters first arrived, because there was tremendous pushback. They were seen as being dangerous. People who were pedestrians or people with disabilities or drivers were all like, get these things out of my way. Even cyclists were resentful. And I ended up writing an article in City Lab about how it's really a function of there being a limited right of way in streets, certainly in American streets. I think the same is true in the UK. And that led to, frankly, probably more of a backlash than scooters may have even deserved. Because people basically were like, I don't want another form factor to compete with, is what I think was really driving it. And you saw some cities impose such strong regulations against scooters or charge so much fees that the scooter companies simply left. That happened in Charlottesville, Virginia. It happened in Raleigh, North Carolina, and a number of other, Phoenix, Arizona, even a huge city. But then, interestingly, last year, a number of cities started doing assessments, including Chicago. So it's unfortunately that the Chicago DOT commissioner couldn't join us today, but Chicago and Portland and Hoboken, New Jersey, and Arlington, Virginia are among the cities that basically said, look, who's actually using these scooters and what kind of trips are they taking? What would they have done otherwise? And interesting, I already saw we had one question submitted asking, what about people who are using scooters in place of walking or biking? And there is some of that, to be fair. But the plurality of trips that have been taken by scooters pretty much across the board in American cities, around 40%, give or take, seem to be coming from automobile trips, a ride-hail trip or a personal automobile trip. And that sort of created like a policy tailwind for scooter deployments such that they now are a little bit more favored, I would say, by city transportation officials, and they're sort of growing in acceptance in the United States as a form factor, and there's probably a little bit less pushback now than there was. There's been a lot of policy developments and policy evolutions in terms of how fleet size is determined and the number of vendors that you have and how you think about docking versus undocked. And I'm happy to explore that further, but I do feel like there's a number of lessons, both positive and negative, from what American cities have done that I would think could be relevant in the UK.
Okay, let's go straight to, thanks, David. Let's go straight to some questions then. So first question I've got, and again, sort of quick answers, but feel free to sort of pipe in. Do we need these trials? Could we not just legalize the lot and go for it?
I think we do need the trials, yeah. We're learning a huge amount about what good deployment looks like and how to manage the deployment. And I think, reflecting on what David said, one of the things the UK, I think, is generally doing differently is quite modest initial deployments. And I think certainly the shock of introducing a lot of scooters at once is probably what gets that significant pushback. I think any change to the public realm and urban form needs kind of a gentle introduction, and that's more what the UK approach is, and the trials are part of that.
And is that because we got slightly burnt by dockless bikes, Mike?
I'm sure that's featured in thinking, yeah. But I think just generally, it's clear we didn't have a legal mechanism to do a blanket thing would be quite challenging with some risks attendant in that. Generally prudent to enable the DFT, and I'm sure if James was on, he would say this, the learning from the trials enables the DFT to then think about what a properly constituted regulation and legislative position would look like, with a lot less risks attached to that, particularly given that our parliamentary agenda is so crammed, so challenged. they're only going to get one shot to get this right, and the trials can help inform that.
Can I offer a point? While I understand the value and I appreciate the value of pilots and trials, we call them pilots more in the United States, you can make them too small. And cities like Chicago actually is one that made its first pilot too small. And what I mean by that is you think of a given geography, and then you overlay that on top of, first of all, geography can't be so limited that people are going to say, why do I want to take a scooter to go 5 blocks? I could just walk. You want to provide a big enough geography so that it is actually a viable form factor as an option. But then also you need a minimum number of devices to actually make it feasible for a decent number of people to find a device within the few blocks walk shed that they're likely to go to. And Chicago is an example. This has been written about, of a city that in its first pilot limited the pilot too much, to the point that nobody really used it, not because they didn't like scooters, but because it wasn't actually fulfilling a useful role. And so I think this is something that I think scooter companies, especially Lyman Bird and Spin, which are very experienced now based on what they've done in North America and on the continent, ask them. They know, but frankly, when you're talking about too small a geography or too limited a number of devices, and yes, they have self-interest, but I do think that there are some good points they can make about when a pilot could fail, not because of the technology or people's interest in it, but because of the way the pilot is designed.
Yeah. Brian, Sam, are you broadly in favour of the trials?
Yeah, from my point of view, yeah, absolutely. You kindly or perhaps unkindly introduced me with 30 years experience in transport planning, but none of that has been in scooters. And again, we were starting from a very quick start. This came out of government very quickly, and we're asked to respond rapidly to develop something. And there was a huge risk of trying to set in something that just wouldn't work. So I think this 12-month trial period, because we're licensed to operate for 12 months from launch, gives us the opportunity to learn so much from the trial. And with a fair wind and how things are going, that will enable us to get things right when we come to perhaps start letting longer term concession type contracts that will run for many years. And we'll have the experience through the trials to get it more right than wrong. So I think it's incredibly valuable to do that. And I absolutely agree with the point that it needs to be at scale so you understand everything around the trial. But therefore, it makes the job quite difficult to manage them, because you are taking a little bit of a risk around allowing this to happen without the experience. So developing the relationship with the operators, working with them and getting responsive and putting metrics in place to make them responsive, not that they've not been, is a good experience we're starting to see, so we can refine and develop the operation in the city.
Yeah. And Sam, are you broadly in favour?
Yeah, no, I am. I think the trials are really positive, because I think there's, even just locally, there's been so much learning in 2 months of things that you might not have thought about otherwise that have really improved it. And I think for us, we started off with a fleet of 200, we're now up to about 400. Kind of area expands, but as we do that, we're able to kind of engage with people through that process. So, for example, we meet with the police each week to kind of talk about issues and troubleshoot things. And I think that's helped us to kind of really improve the scheme. And earlier I was in a meeting with one of the business parks that we're looking to expand to make sure we're doing so kind of in partnership with them. And it was kind of the council, Voi, the police and the business park kind of working through that. And I think through doing trials, you get to do those kind of processes in a way that you might not say if DFT have just said e-scooters are legal, anyone can buy them and use them in whichever way they want. So I think they're really positive in that sense.
Right. So lots of challenges in bringing this new service, these new technologies onto our streets. I'm interested in the kind of city authority view, and we've got 3 represented here, and David may have a view too, about how you balance when you're sort of drawing these things up. How do you balance the environmental, commercial, and social factors, and maybe even safety factors too, when you're sort of setting these processes up and making your decisions? What's that been like, and how do you see that evolving?
We've used classic kind of public procurement process for a concession, really. So we identified all of the factors around environment, particularly interested in the equalities and inclusion agenda, and what e-scooters could do for that. and safety was obviously absolutely at the heart of it. So we set those for criterias. We actually did quite a lot of work with the supply chain, with the e-scooter suppliers, before we actually went out to go through the formal process and let that define the criteria. And the model we adopted was, I think, then subsequently has been adopted by Liverpool and WECA and others. So we shared the kind of procurement approach, and others have adopted it. We found it very positive, actually. We found a very positive reception from the supply chain to engage in the process, and it wasn't really a compromise. We the really, really good quality propositions. For us, Voi was head and shoulders the leader in that, and there was no compromise between any of those. The great opposite terms of environment, inclusion, safety, the whole lot.
Great. Brian and Sam, what's been your experience? And have you found, maybe particularly on the safety issue, just merging one of the questions that came in, that there's enough out there or enough standards around safety to make these things sort of doable, like balanceable?
I think safety is always going to be a really interesting kind of issue with the trials. And I think so like Mike, we've gone with Voi, and I think one of the things we were really attracted to was their experience, but also kind of having conversations about how quickly that we're able to make changes should we feel something needs to be done. And I think with safety, one of the things that comes up often is that so now the clocks have changed. We've been having conversations that actually not all e-scooter riders are as visible as we might like them to be, but we know from kind of working with the police and other people, that's a problem for pedestrians and cyclists. It's not just distinct to e-scooter users. So I think where we've got, say, safety issues such as visibility, you have those in other kind of forms of transport. I know other things like parking often comes up, and I think for us, there's kind of the measured approach of user education is always really important about this is why you should park in a certain way, this is why you should park in a certain place, but also kind of as well as education, we've got the ability, and Voi, work with us really quickly to be able to do this, to issue warnings, to block accounts if we feel that actually it's not an educational issue, that there's something that's going on. And we also have kind of 24-hour staffing to go around, and Voi will do that rebalancing, and if e-scooters, they haven't been parked in the way that we would like, to move them. Obviously, there's always room to improve, particularly from a kind of user perspective, but I do think sometimes that just comes down to education. So I think that's something that we're really keen to kind of push with users in that sense. And where necessary, issue those warnings.
The only thing I can add to that, because I think most of what's been said, we are following a similar approach, but we also, going back to your original question, how do we ensure this is a sound thing for all our residents? We were very clear with the objectives we wanted the scooter scheme to achieve for our city. It was about increasing mobility. And remember, this came out of the COVID emergency, that we were suffering from restricted use of public transport. Some people were suffering access to that. So we wanted a mobility service that could fill the gap. And so we were very clear in our procurement route, alongside all the safety considerations, that we had responses from the companies that helped us achieve our wider objectives of improving mobility for our citizens. So again, that was a key factor within the rules we set for the operators to come in and try to address.
So just David, perhaps given your advanced knowledge of a more advanced market, I mean, in my sense, and I'm something of a close watcher, my sense is that this sort of new industry is starting to care much more about inclusion aspects and about sustainability. Now we've kind of broken through the first levels, if you like, of, hey, we've got this new stuff on the road. What's your sense about where things are heading in this universe around carbon, around making sure these services reach areas where the market wouldn't necessarily want to go?
Right. Well, those are two very different questions. In terms of what's happening with regards to equity, it's the term we use, and what's happening with regards to sustainability. With regards to sustainability, maybe I'll approach that one first. I think the fact that scooters do seem, at least in the States, to replace quite a bit of car trips means that they're seen as a relatively sustainable mode, all else being equal, by most city transportation officials in the US. Now, that said, it could still be better, and from a sustainability perspective. And I think in an effort, because we have a very competitive market in the US with a lot of vendors trying to vie for example, New York City is going to have scooters for the first time in the outer boroughs outside of Manhattan next year. And the scooter companies really want to win that concession. So to compete, sustainability is part of it. And one way to compete is to, for example, find ways to collect and redeploy the scooters in electric vans instead of using modes of transportation that are going to be more polluting, or use cargo bikes to collect them and redeploy them. There's talk also now and some efforts to use teleoperated, sort of like autonomous scooters almost, that would redeploy themselves, again, as a way of reducing the overall carbon footprint. That's some of what's happening around sustainability right now. With regards to equity, it's a little different. There's certainly a strong desire to make sure that this mode of transportation is available in low-income communities in American cities. Part of the challenge, I think it's a little bit of a weird approach. I'm not sure I totally agree with how cities are doing it in the US. Part of it is that, these devices are quite expensive in the States. A 10-minute bird trip in Los Angeles could cost you upwards of $4.50, which is a lot to take twice a day if you're going to be using it as a commuting mode. So the idea of making a mode like this available in low-income communities is a little bit strange to me. But there is an effort underway usually to mandate that a certain portion of a fleet be deployed in low-income neighborhoods, and often also a requirement that low-income riders be able to get discounted trips. Now, it's a different question of whether people actually take advantage of that opportunity to get low-income qualifications and actually enjoy the discounts. But that just to answer your question of what the landscape is, Rob, that's what I'm seeing in the US right now.
That's very useful to hear. I know that there's definitely moves in that direction you just described in New York. I'm also just going back on the sustainability point. As a sort of watcher on the research on this side, in this space, the OECD report, which came out recently, was pretty harsh on shared e-scooters. Now, yes, they might look pretty good when compared to, say, taking an Uber, but their green credentials did not come up well. Certainly first generation and even second generation shared e-scooters. So my sense, particularly from a kind of London point of view and from a view that carbon is one of our biggest challenges, decarbonising transport is a really big challenge that we face over the next 10 years. It feels like a really big issue. And so the more we see firms competing to make their services more sustainable, the better, in my view. For what it's worth. I want to move on a bit to technology questions. We've had a couple of questions about technology. And maybe this is one for sort of quick fire responses, but the move again internationally seems to be away from dockless schemes. I guess that's probably, possibly true in e-bikes as well as e-scooters. Any quick thoughts from anyone on dockless versus docked? I think most of the UK trials have gone dockless on e-scooters, but I'm happy to be corrected. Any thoughts from anyone? Go on, Dave.
I don't want to go first, but I have thoughts. Sam, you go first. I'll follow you.
You sure? Okay. So we are dockless. We have an incentivized parking zone, so people get discounts for parking in places that we've deemed a sensible place to park. That's not to say we won't be bringing in docks. Part of the, intelligence gathering of the trial was we wanted to get an understanding of where people actually wanted to go to and from, because we're conscious that there's no point putting that kind of infrastructure in if it doesn't get used. And I think, I know people, there is the kind of concern about parking with dockless schemes, but I've worked in kind of local authorities that have had docked bike systems, and actually I've seen kind of docked areas with 2-3 times more bikes than should have been parked there because everyone was parking there, and then they overspill and take up a lot of space. So kind of having a dock system doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to get street clutter. I think the kind of way that you rebalance and the way that you work with users and look at actually where they're trying to go to and from is probably a big important factor. It's not just about docked or dockless. And that'd be my kind of thoughts on it based on what we've experienced so far.
Thanks, Sam. David.
Yeah, so this is that's interesting, Sam. To what you're and I agree with a lot of your observations. This is a topic I actually went really deep into in an article I wrote in the Atlantic City Lab. I guess it's now Bloomberg City Lab, but whatever. 9 months ago, basically docked versus dockless. And I strongly encourage. We have a lot of city officials, I understand, on the call here. There's a big difference in what's appropriate in a dense urban environment, meaning like central London, versus what's appropriate in a more suburban landscape, meaning you've got a more spread out community of single family homes. And I'm happy to share this article. Unfortunately, I don't have the link. I have a website, davidzipper.com, where you can find it. But basically the point is, in a dense environment, docks make a lot of sense because there sidewalks are heavily used. It's a problem really if you're blocking people who are in a wheelchair or need to walk or have a suitcase or whatever. But also because of the density, by definition, you can probably have enough docks that people can find a docked device within a block or two, or maybe 3. That's not the same in a low density environment or suburban environment, where if you require docks there, they're going to be so spread out that some people are going to say, I just don't feel like taking a scooter because I've got to park it 8 blocks away from where I'm going, or the nearest one to begin my trip is 8 blocks away. Forget it. I'm just going to drive or take an Uber. So I strongly encourage sort of dividing between dense versus less dense environments when thinking about the relative desirability of a docking scheme.
Interesting. And I think, though, that there's a bit of a sort of counter examples in Europe. I mean, I was talking to someone from Stockholm the other day in an event, and she was saying that they're very happy with e-scooters. They've got lots of them. I mean, really lots. In Stockholm, they initially had parking zones, and they just stopped because they weren't providing anyone any benefit, neither the authorities nor the users. So, and I think Paris is moving in the same direction. Interesting how these things are flowing. I want to move on to geofencing, the technology I've been known to be excited about in the past. I'm not sure I'm as excited as I used to be. But an interesting technology that's definitely going to have more of a role in how we move around in the future, not just on e-scooters, I think. What do people think? Is this a factor in how you're deploying? Are you looking at becoming sort of regulatory authorities via geofencing, or is it a bit of a sideshow? I mean,
as others on the call have said, I'm probably, this is my first e-scooter trial because they're new to us. My feelings about geofencing is really positive. I think how we've been using it in Northampton, one in terms of kind of incentivized parking zones, I think works really well. But actually the way that, as we've learned from the trial, we've been able to create slow zones. So areas where when the scooter goes into them, it will drop to 3-6 miles an hour, depending on what we deem appropriate. So if we kind of have said, oh, actually, this is quite a busy area, there's lots of pedestrians, we need to slow them down. For us, it's been a kind of really useful thing. Again, we've created no park zones, so you can't end your ride kind of in a space that we designate. Actually, this isn't somewhere we want people ending rides. So I think while there's always kind of tweaking to that technology, and we've certainly tweaked the more we've learned about the project, but also the kind of requirements of the town. I think if you're thinking about what you need and what users are experiencing, but also other members of the public, and then you're throwing that in with testing it, because if you just put it in without that testing, you're not going to know. I think it can work really well. But obviously, I'm not a tech person by background. I'm more focused on that kind of the benefits that it can bring to the public. So I don't know, other people might have different opinions on it.
I'd agree with Sam's experience there. We've found geofencing to be invaluable, both practically in terms of managing the operational environment. Birmingham has a really quite complex geofence arrangement. We had it perhaps a bit too complex to start with. We then simplified it, but it's worked well. But it's also been critical for political support, to be honest. The politicians have placed a lot of store around that, and having the confidence then that even if somebody is determined to be an irresponsible user, actually the technology can then shut that scooter down And it's been quite a learning curve working with it. And I think the experience has driven the operators to refine the technology. So I think we're on a kind of the third iterative refinement of the geofencing technology at the moment, just being rolled out, and it's got progressively better. So we're quite impressed with the direction it's going in.
Thanks, Mike. I have to say, I sense that there's a market opportunity for someone to invent, maybe it's already out there, a kind of retrofitting device onto cars, which allows us to geofence them. And that brings me on to a kind of broader point, really, which is, are we in danger with these new lower carbon, pretty user-friendly means of moving around? Are we in danger of judging them by much higher standards than we are of other vehicles and other road uses? What's your views?
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, it's something we talk about quite a lot at work. Talk about it virtually, not actually in work, but I think, and we've, the kind of example I raised earlier about the dark nights, and actually we've had some criticism in terms of e-scooter riders, but we know that that's something that cyclists do as well. It's the same with pavement riding, that actually we know that's something that cyclists do, even though that they shouldn't. And I think partly because the scheme is new, and I think, for some people it's not something they're 100% thrilled about. I think there is the ability to be quite critical of that. And I think, I've seen some interesting conversations around, you could hire one and give it to your child, or you could use it when you were drunk, and actually you could get in a car when you were drunk, you could cycle when you were drunk. In theory, you could hire a car and put a child in it. Wouldn't advise any of those things, but I think, I think people can be really critical of them just because they're new. And I think in the same way, not every, if one driver, cuts me up on the road, I don't think all drivers are irresponsible, but I think sometimes with e-scooter users and sometimes to a lesser extent cyclists, they can kind of be viewed as all e-scooter riders are irresponsible, or all cyclists are going where they shouldn't be. So I think for us there's a massive balance of talking about legitimate concerns and things we need to do to make the scheme safer and better, and things we're actually working on, and things where you're like, when we talk about we've got 10,000 unique users, the vast majority of those are using them as we would hope and are using them sensibly. So I think I'm not saying completely unfairly blamed, because I'm not saying there's not misuse, because in any trial there's going to be, but I guess I'm saying that it can be quite easy to be maybe more critical than we might in other situations.
Yeah, Brian, I'm interested in the Milton Keynes experience, because it's sort of famous for a few things transport related. So both, kind of innovation. I would say that I used to work at the Catapult. But also, quite fast-flowing dual carriageways and roundabouts, cars moving at speed, both a good thing and a bad thing. How's this gone? How are scooters gone down on the roads, as it were? And do you share this sort of worry? I guess it's coming from me, that micromobility forms are being judged by higher standards.
Yeah, I think to answer that, it is a concern. Milton Keynes, we've got grid road systems, 70 mile an hour dual carriageways throughout that urban area. But if you were to design the city, I think, to operate scooters in, it wouldn't be far off what Milton Keynes got in terms of its network. So we're operating scooters on 250 kilometres of segregated cycle tracks, our Redway network. So we can absolutely keep them away from busy high-speed roads. So it's really worked to our advantage in those areas, and equally to our advantage, those cycle routes are not terribly well used by cyclists. So we've got almost a perfect storm to allow scooters to operate in Milton Keynes, and I think that's part of the popularity that we feel that they've come. I think we still have suffered from some issues around the quickness of the launch. We've not had time to explain scooters, their technology, their capabilities fully to our residents. So there's a groundswell of understanding of what they can do. And for that, you get the fear of the unknown coming out, and you then get the questions coming out, and that's where it's, well, you've got to create this new mode to a much higher spec, because not many people understand it. So I think it suffers a little bit from that. Going back to the point about geofencing, I'd like to make a point that, again, agree with most of what my colleagues say, but I think the geofencing is not as accurate and as capable as perhaps we might think. And we think about that in Milton Keynes with our grid roads. debate, should we geofence them away from fast moving grid roads that we don't want scooters on, full stop. But if we do that, and then one scooter can get across because it hasn't had the ping of the signal, next time that scooter rider tries to get across the road, the signal pings and it's geofenced out. So the latency means it's quite dangerous to promise something that doesn't quite deliver when you're in a safety critical environment. So absolutely great for zoning and speeding, and we've applied that, but you've got to be a little bit careful about how it's sold and used as a technology.
So currently, I don't know Milton Keynes enough to know what's going on, but currently, do the bikes and the e-scooters they're allowed to use the fast flowing roads, but they generally don't? Is that the situation?
Yes, I think legally they're allowed to use them, but we massively encourage them in education, keep them away. I think our residents know to keep away from them, but technically a cycle can use them. Despite what I've said, there's some areas that we know the accuracy is good enough, we can keep them away from grid roads. So we market it very heavily, use our Redway network that's entirely safe, segregated or safer, and use our lower speed city roads within the city centre environment where we've got lots of lower speed shared surfaces.
I wish we had time to go into more questions because there's a few that I haven't been able to get to. So apologies to anyone that's submitted a question that we haven't been able to attend to. I need to do a little plug for something I'm involved in, which I mentioned at the beginning, which is called the London Micromobility Alliance. We as a think tank are very keen on micromobility in kind of all its forms, really, including shared e-scooters. And we've set up a bit of a group to kind of make the case and do research to push the agenda in London. So if anyone watching hasn't heard of that and wants to find out more, please go to Centre for London's website. There's more there. Or get in touch with me directly through all the different channels we can use these days. So it just falls to me to say, to wrap things up and say thank you to Zag for organising the event. Brilliant that you're around, frankly, doing what you do. So really great to be invited. To thank again sponsors, the Trends Section partner DOT, and the event sponsors Bird and Link, companies I've been talking to a fair bit, as have many of you, I'm sure. And finally, to say thank you, both to the audience for joining us, watching, submitting questions, using the chat, and also to our fantastic panel, Brian, Mike, Sam, and David. Thank you all so much for joining us.